All right. Well, Professor Lucas Kwong, thank you so much for rejoining us on Public Theologians.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so last time we talked about it was kind of early on in your effort to call out Christian xenophobia.
Yeah.
So you just had released your open letter on anti-Asian racism and Christian nationalism letter, and we're starting to get some signatories. So give us a little update on that and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So, I mean, since talking to you, I don't know how many months it's been. It's like 5 months, and it feels like we're doing this for a year.
Exactly.
The big developments have been, well, first, many more people have signed on, which is fantastic. We're at 700 or 800, between 700 800 people at the moment. Religion News ran a piece at the beginning of July, which was just great to have an extra outlet beyond my, I've sort of been feverishly writing editorials, just trying to get eyeballs on it. So it's nice for someone else to write it. So, it takes the pressure off me a bit.
Yeah.
And then there was quite a bit of activity in early July because of my efforts to garner the attention of, well, there were 3 major annual conferences: the SBC, which is several of the politicians named in the letter chosen denomination, as well as the EPC, which is Mike Pompeo's and Josh Hawley's denomination, and the PCA, which is Ben Sass and Marsha Blackburn's denomination. So, I figured, well, these people are going to be gathered, and if they're not there, then they'll surely be following online. So I used the hashtag. I did a bit of a hashtag activism to try to garner the attention of these various conferences. So the SBC one, obviously the SBC one is like the, I don't know if it's correct, called the Woodstock of conservative Christian evangelical, but it's definitely the one that everyone was paying attention to, right? Because of the Ed Litton versus Mike Stone race. And the EPCs, which is, I guess I should slow down for the uninitiated. The evangelical, right. There's so many acronyms.
Right.
The evangelical Presbyterian churches,
yes,
and the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, were subsequent to the SBC, Southern Baptist Convention. So the EPC is one of several sort of conservative splinters from the original Presbyterian Church. EPC had their conference at the end of July, end of June, I want to say, in Memphis. So, they actually had a website where they embedded their Twitter feed of any tweet that was tagged with their official tag.
Sure.
So this was my first time doing it. So I figured, okay, let's just dive in. So I started using this tag and linking to the open letter, and they took down the live stream within the first half hour or something like that. So someone over there really was not happy about it.
Yeah.
And I also had emailed the EPCs. They have this thing called the Revelation 7-9 Task Force. Revelation 7-9 being the verse that talks about being, I saw, a group from every tribe, nation, and tongue, right? So this is a task force that is putatively devoted to racial justice, and they actually had a panel discussion at the conference. And so I reached out to all of them, and one person, I don't really want to name who it is, but one person was sympathetic.
Yeah, that's great.
But this is a task force, I don't know how many, 10 or 12 people.
Mm-hmm.
Another person wrote back and said, just like, basically, don't talk to me, talk to the other person who talked to you, which was, kind of a remarkably, for someone who's on the racial justice panel, sounded somewhat disinterested in talking about racial justice.
That is shocking. Yeah.
And he said something like, listen, if you want to talk about God and what God's doing in your life, that's great. If not, I decline, which was funny because, well, this is what God's doing in my life. He's going me to write this
Yeah.
open letter calling out the anti-Asian racism and nature Christian nationalist politicians, but it's kind of like not like that.
Yeah, no.
So
we want you to show up, but not like that. Yeah,
exactly.
not to challenge our authority. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's curious because this task force, like, I don't want to single them out as whatever, because they're by no means anomalous. So really, sure. I should preface this, it's not about them, but I'm just using this as an example of how pervasive this issue is, right? They have this report, which is about, it's a useful report in some ways. It lays out statistics of surveys of the EPC and laments the fact that just concern about racial justice, is at a minimum. You control F, search for the actual word racism does not appear in this report. So that's interesting in of itself.
Yeah.
The sympathetic person who wrote me said, I sympathize, but basically said, we can't call out these politicians right now specifically, because basically that it would be too inflammatory, that we need more time and to get the denomination on board.
We'll put a study together, essentially.
Yeah. I guess there's always been, well, yeah, exactly. I don't know. I mean, there's been several reports already. So if anybody on this task force is listening, I welcome your elaboration of what else is needed. But and this person said, I would love to support, but, and this is, again, not anomalous. If I, in my capacity as an official representative of the church, sign on to this, there's going to be immediate blowback, right? And that has been a refrain, both from non-Asians and Asian clergymen. So that was the EPC, and then someone else, like, I got into this really long DM conversation with this EPC pastor who said, like, people were freaking out when they saw that you had hijacked the live stream, and they were like, who is this madman? I could tell you I was in the room, and all these elderly people were so confused. And I was like, all right, okay, it's good for me to know. All right. But and I got that would be disruptive, but
sure.
Then he was saying, so, it was really rude. It was really rude what you did. And I was like, well, okay, that's interesting that you find that this is rude,
yes,
and not, the insightful stochastic terrorism that I'm trying to draw attention to.
Right. I mean, I think it would make sense on some level for them to sort of people to be denying or saying this is something that doesn't happen. But yeah, to say, yeah, you're right, there is incredible anti-Asian racism coming from our own people, but the cost of that would be really hard on me or hard on somebody that is kind of the scapegoat, instead of saying, yeah, that's a problem, we should actually address it.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and what was about the thing about that conversation is, I actually had a chance to sort of explain, I'm not a monster, I'm not like a terrorist, I'm just someone who's concerned about this. And even when we had finally gotten to some kind of understanding, I had to go, and he said, okay, if you want to pick this up again, I think we should talk about next whether investigating the origins of the coronavirus constitutes an act of racial prejudice. So we can talk about this later, but that really emblematizes to me, how the extent to which now this investigation into the Wuhan lab theory, the idea being that the coronavirus was genetically engineered or somehow deliberately let loose, has offered a really powerful cover, for so much that has transpired over the last year in terms of anti-Asian racism. And on that note, when I reached out to members of the PCA, I found emails of people who were delivering panels at the Presbyterian Church in America. So now this is Marsha Blackburn's and Ben Sass's denomination. And one of them was about, this was literally a panel about political rhetoric. So, all right. So you want to talk about what it means to have conversations as Christians in the church.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote to him and I said, hey, at your panel, would you be willing, here's my open letter, here are the facts, here's the evidence. Would you be willing to talk about this? And he wrote back, and we had, again, it was a perfectly pleasant conversation, but
Sure.
the one lab theory came up once again, and it was like, I don't think it's right to say that this is racist, or we don't know anything about the motives of the people who said this because they're just doing their job, something like that, right?
Which is always hilarious, because I mean, how could anybody know the motives of anybody? I mean, I don't know my own motivations very well a lot of the times. I mean, but what I say still has impact, and what I do still has impact.
Exactly.
But I guess that starts and ends with some of us.
Exactly. And again, this was like, used to be Sunday school 101, that verse in Proverbs about the man shooting flaming arrows,
Sure.
And I told him, like, as many different exegetical perspectives there are in the church, I've yet to find an interpreter of that verse that sees that verse as somehow absolving the person, shooting flaming arrows on the basis that they were only joking. I don't think that's, hidden in Karl Barth's commentaries or anything like that.
No, yeah.
That's very basic.
Right. Unless you can be inside somebody's head, you can't denounce anything or critique anything that's being said or done. Okay.
All you know is that a flaming arrow just, crashed through your window, Which
is also kind of as a side note, coming from I don't know specifically the people again that you're mentioning, but coming from kind of a real opposition to doing serious personal work, whether it be in therapy or any sort of real self-reflection, that's kind of not in not outside of just kind of mortification of sin and vivification of the spirit. There's not much more reflection than just what is right, what is wrong in myself. There's not self-awareness being taught. Yeah.
Well, we can talk about that too, how, there's this, it might be congenital to modern evangelicalism now, this resistance to self-awareness and self-reflection. And, funny that you mentioned therapy. So, in addition to these exchanges, I had many more charming exchanges with irate attendees of these conferences who found they found it because I tried to use I was using the hashtags to draw attention to the open letter, and, predictably called a communist sympathizer. And, but my favorite reason that I was called a communist sympathizer was, I was getting kind of exasperated with this person who, let's just say they were, like many people, expressed in implicit attachment to various conspiracy theories. So I said, you might want to look into therapy, basically. And he said, his exact words were like, what a classic communist move, telling me that I need therapy because you disagree with me. I was like, wow, I haven't heard that. This is like Manchurian candidate stuff,
Hardcore communists are well known.
Hardcore.
They're the only ones, apparently. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was, I thank that person for bringing some joy to my day.
Right.
So
the Trotskyites were just lining up for
exactly. I think this guy has an idea that that I've got this prison camp in my backyard, and I'm pulling in all these defenders of freedom and doing the Clockwork Orange thing where you pull their eyes open.
That's right after your therapy session. Clearly,
exactly. Yeah. But it's funny because I knew the extremity of views that were out there before I did this, but it was still really, really eye-opening to see that. And then other people being like, well, if this virus came out in my state and everybody called it, the North Carolina virus or the Tennessee virus or whatever, nobody would have a problem with it, and just it's like, is that even worth responding to? I don't know, but that it is instructive that is the level of defensiveness out there, So yeah, those are my experiences with that. And then since then, it is on a more positive note. The presbytery of Marsha Blackburn's church, Christ Presbyterian, did write back, and they actually told me that they would be discussing their open letter at the August presbytery meeting. So again, I don't know if they're listening, but I am curious to see what happened. And similarly, Paul Gosar's Catholic, the Diocese of Phoenix, wrote back and said that the Racial Reconciliation Committee would be discussing the letter. Now, I have not heard back from them either since that communication. So, but those are the two most promising developments.
Interesting. Yeah, that's hopefully they'll surprise us all and
hopefully,
right. I mean, and that's I think that's the goal. Obviously, there's a lot of prophetic speaking into this, but the goal of that is to, of really any prophetic work is to trouble the comfortable and comfort the troubled, or something.
Yes,
afflict
exactly.
the comfortable and
afflict the comfortable, comfort the afflicted.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of it is making folks uncomfortable. And if we're coming from a truly Christian standpoint, then hopefully that initial defensiveness that we feel can give way to actual self-reflection, which is a deeply spiritual and historically Christian perspective. Maybe not mainstream right now. Yeah. Right. So I wanted to kind of dig in a little bit more to the lab leak situation, conspiracy, maybe theory, but in these last few months, I think there's been some pretty troubling things coming from the CDC, and that there was this big push early on in 2020 to completely discredit any kind of conversation and really censor any conversation about that might be some sort of accidental leak. And so, now you have scientists saying, and even Dr. Fauci, we kind of thought it was a possibility that this happened back then, and it's not really, you can't disprove it till we really know what happened, which is kind of a lot of speculation. But to me, it kind of seems like almost this feeding of the fire of, you have these wild conspiracy theories that there's this deep intentionality from the communist Chinese government. And instead of saying, okay, well, it's possible because there is the Wuhan Institute of Virology that's actually partially funded by the United States of America that's studying and has been studying these viruses. So yeah, I'm curious kind of your thoughts on that. And then mainly because this is all sort of super speculative and there's maybe like a 5% chance there's anything to the man-made nonsense. And then it's even more remote that there's any intentionality with this. But yeah, I'm curious, again, your thoughts and mostly kind of the blowback on your community on this.
Yeah. So the first thing I think we should establish for listeners is, yes, there, obviously there has been a lot of talk that picked up because Biden said that he would call for an investigation into the origins of this virus. The problem is, what has gotten lost is the scientists were quite clear last year that actual analysis of the DNA takes the notion of engineering off the table. It is just, there is no substance evidence, first of all, that it was engineered. Now, other people will have the rejoinder, well, we don't know if they found it naturally and then released it, right? But similarly, like you said, we are dealing with speculation, bordering on science fiction at this point, concerning whether that happened. What we do know is that the predominant strain when it came over was from Europe, right? We don't even talk about that anymore. So many developments have taken place that that has not really been established.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the glaring fact that we were living with an administration that dismantled a pandemic response team in 2018, practically did everything to make America as defenseless as possible against a virus that didn't need to claim hundreds of thousands of lives. And, all of it just is very simple. When you look at the mountain of data, where should we focus our attention, our efforts, and our desire for accountability? Is it with the Wuhan lab, which, almost certainly did not engineer this virus, and we may never know, short of basically living in an entirely different world where there's international cooperation into an investigation that's not led by a belligerent America that is devoted to great conflict, power competition.
Yeah.
If we lived in that universe, maybe there would be grounds under those conditions for an investigation. But we don't live in that universe, right? We live in a universe where whatever happens as a result of this investigation is occurring against the backdrop of this inflated China threat, right? Which has now prompted the Senate to call for $25 billion more to be added to the Pentagon budget, which is literally money that could have ended homelessness in America, right? Yeah. So
just the increase.
Exactly.
Yes.
So all of that combines, and you talk about blowback. The thing that I think people don't understand at this point is just how much the lab leak theory had already metastasized. That these distinctions between whether it was engineered at the lab or simply accidentally let loose, this is a distinction without a difference when you are someone who is steeped 24/7 in QAnon, Fox News. And so again, there was nothing unexpected about it. That again and again, the pushback has been, well, turns out we were right, that it came from a lab. So therefore, what are you complaining about? Using to sweep aside, the effects of terms like China virus, the Kung flu, whatever, all because, well, we were proven right because Biden has called for this investigation.
You were proven that the possibility of your wild theory is like
exactly
0.0005 to line up all the nonsense instead of like zero. So it's like, okay, technically, like one of the things that you said has like the most remote possibility of
precisely. And it reminds me of, this is not original, Jeff Charlotte was talking about how what we have in QAnon and conspiracy theories is a new Gnosticism, right? This new obsession with secret knowledge, which is no longer focused on, all the orders of angels and archons, but is focused on what happened at the Wuhan lab. And we really have that. We have this obsession over secret knowledge, which somehow confers this sense of being part of the elect. And that is extremely powerful. And what has now happened is that it's only given those people further incentive. And sadly, it's even gotten into the Asian American Christian community. Casey, I'll tell you, I know somebody whose mother has been radicalized, for lack of a better word, via Chinese language podcasts. And, they are out there that sort of propagate QAnon. And there was actually a Chinese pastor who I was in contact with who was sympathetic. But he said, we've gone through a lot as a church. If I sign on this letter, it will split my denomination or my church. And then separately from that, there was an elder at the church who received my opening inquiry, and he wrote back. And among the things that he asked was like, "Who do you really work for?" And then
what
I told
is this money-making venture that you
exactly what do you know about gain of function research? And the pastor, when I told the pastor about it, he said, "I'm so sorry, there are people in our church who believe in conspiracy theories." So I put two and two together, like, all right, that's what he needs. Who do I work for? It's the old Manchurian candidate thing.
Right.
And the Chinese people are not immune to it. And I wrote about this in ICS, Institute for Christian Socialism, Bias magazine, about how 50 years of the model minority stereotype being internalized, and this expectation that to be Asian is to be one of the quote unquote good ones,
Sure.
inevitably translates into a proximity to whiteness, inevitably translates into reactionary religiosity through many, not all, but certainly a large enough quarter of Asian American Christianity, that there are going to be people who side with conservative white evangelicalism.
Yeah, even against kind of their own history and yeah, I mean, I think that's a political project of the conservative movement over these last 40 years or so, is getting people to vote against their own interests, whether those are ethnic groups or class groups, is to always
precisely.
Yeah, that's red meat for not just the users of Fox News, I mean, sure, but more importantly is to funders of Fox News and to folks that are behind the Paul Gosars of the world financially. So
precisely.
Yeah, so I wanted to also talk real quick, and you've written about this over the several months since the Atlanta Spa massacres, but can you just talk about, because that was committed by a young man that was a part of his church, and there was some really inflaming rhetoric. Obviously that's kind of faded from the news, I guess. Not kind of, it's definitely faded from the news. And
absolutely.
the real explanations given sort of immediately were that he was a sexual addict, which in our society basically means he's less than nothing. So whatever he did was just a continuation of being the least of the people on earth. So, but there's the fact that he massacred all Asian folks speaks to, and that there was that Christian nationalism behind there, in the words of his pastor. So again, you wrote about that. Can you give us a little fill in on that?
Sure. So maybe I can do this I'm going to double back to talking about the PCA conference, but it is relevant to this question.
Sure.
Because there was a resolution, these conferences, different Presbyterians proposed resolutions that are to pass or decline. One of them was to condemn anti-Asian racism. And that resolution specifically mentioned the Atlanta Spa shootings as one, probably the most egregious and infamous example of anti-Asian racism this year. The original form of the resolution was not passed. Instead, what was passed was a much more truncated and frankly, much more generic statement that included the statement, we grieve with our Asian American brothers and sisters over what they've experienced this past year, whether that pain is due to, I think the wording was unbiblical religious claims, racist pride, or something else. So a resolution to condemn anti-Asian racism is now converted into, we feel your pain, whether or not that pain is caused by racism, couched between unbiblical religion and, I don't know, something else. And so that, to me, encapsulates what happened with the subsequent analysis of the Atlanta Spa shooting. Now, it is undeniable that his views of his misogyny, the biblical, unbiblical, teachings on feminism were most certainly fundamental to what the shooter did. Right. The problem is when we begin to talk about that as somehow, that twisted religion as somehow separate from the racism. That you've got your twisted religion over here and you've got your racism over here. It bears repeating that there is no evidence that he visited Young's Asian Massage before he carried out the shootings. So what that tells us is he picked this place. He saw Asian in the title and assumed this must be a place where there are sex workers, right? This must be a place where, you know, the iniquity and perversion that has caused me to lose everything and be kicked out of my home, which happened the night before he carried out the massacre, must be met with righteous vengeance.
Yeah.
And, you know, there is a very long history of that righteous and sexualized violence being cathected onto Asian women. Particularly, there was a great NBC Asian American piece by Sarah Ngu a couple of months ago that parsed this, that, you know, the view of Asian women in particular, you know, this goes back to the screen actress Anna May Wong in the 30s, right? Has always connoted a particular kind of threat, an eroticized threat that cannot, in that threat, you can't neatly separate out the racism, the misogyny, and the religiosity. So I think that is absolutely crucial to keep in mind when we talk about that shooting. The other thing I'll say is the pastor, while his comments about feminism got a lot of press, and justifiably so, the pastor of the shooter had also made several remarks about Asian culture before the shooting, and you know, they were not exactly positive. You know, in one sermon, you know, he was comparing Christians being strangers in the world to Americans feeling not at home in, I think he mentioned Singapore and Shanghai and Dubai, right?
Gosh.
And he said, I've been in all those places and I didn't feel at home. And that was supposed to be a metaphor, right, for how Christians in the world are supposed to not feel at home. So you think about that, like what message does that send when the metaphor for the Christian experience in the world, quote unquote, is being a white American in an Asian country? You know, that's going to send some kind of message subliminally. So yeah, I think absolutely there has not been nearly enough deconstruction of the combination of attitudes toward women and towards Asians that sort of pervaded his church experience.
Yeah, and I think that separation that is constantly being taken place between race and class, between misogyny and race and class, is really this splinter effect. And that's why you can see the CIA coming out with kind of a solidarity with race kind of situation, or you know, large corporations that kind of do that woke washing situation where they stand in solidarity with whoever it is, and while perpetuating poverty, while continuing along their way of enriching rich people. And and so the conversation too kind of reminds me and is a good lead back into your most recent piece on the whole critical race theory conversation. And this was published in Sojourners on June 24. So you said the title is Christian Opponents of Critical Race Theory Peddle a Hollow Salvation. And in it you talk about how the entire conversation, particularly within evangelical right-wing or just evangelical conservative movements, is always saying, well, critical race theory was created by non-Christians and is not talking about our salvation, is not talking about, you know, going back to the book of Romans, is not talking about justification or sanctification or glorification, which we can talk particularly about the sanctification part, perhaps. But it does miss the point that critical race theory, and it sort of intentionally so, that critical race theory is just a way to talk about the fact that these systems of oppression, racism, class, gender, all these things are endemic to the way we do life in America. And from a historical perspective, it seems silly to argue against any of those points given our horrific history. So you point out in that piece that essentially what I'm reading is that not everything we talk about has to be about who's saved and who's not saved. That's not the point of critical race theory. And it's no one's claiming that except for these folks. So yeah, kind of talk more about that. And
well, you know, I feel like pointing out hypocrisy is almost beating a dead horse, but you know, it remains to be said, one of the darlings of conservative Christianity at this point is James Lindsay, who is an atheist.
Seems important.
Exactly. Now, you know, on one hand, people who champion critical race theory are positing a false salvation because critical race theory doesn't literally, you know, lay out the four spiritual laws. But somehow the opponents of critical race theory are simply living out their faith by partnering with an atheist, you know, and you can name any other thing, you know, voting for the Republican Party doesn't involve stating the four spiritual laws. Watching the movie Braveheart and using it in a sermon, you know, like there's so many artifacts of conservative culture that are somehow baptizable.
Sure,
but critical race theory is not, right? So it's worth pointing that out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as far as salvation, so the point I was trying to make, it wasn't even so much. Not everything is about who's saved. Well, in a certain sense, it is. I think it was about the poverty of our vocabulary in terms of what the phrase "getting saved" has become over, you know, centuries. That to be saved or to be regenerated, because that was what the phrase that came up at the SBC conference, that the SBC leaders said, you know, we oppose, I think it was Adam Greenway, oppose CRT because it doesn't leave room for regeneration. And, you know, that just sort of begs the question, well, what is regeneration? Is regeneration this emotive one-time experience, you know, where you quote unquote get saved at an altar call? When you look at the scriptures, you know, salvation has always been an ongoing affair. You know, the Apostle Paul talks about working out your salvation with fear and trembling, and has always been an embodied affair. That to be saved is not to be raptured into this platonic ethereal realm where you leave your evil flesh behind, right? So that begs the question: well, how does one work out one's salvation as someone who is a psyche, the original word for spirit, inside a body, you know, a body that might experience, among other things, racism. And so that was simply my point, was that I'm not sure that the people who are saying that this is undermining the work of salvation have done enough reflection on what does it mean to be saved? What is it, you know, because when I look at a video of an elderly Asian woman, you know, being beaten in the street or having acid tossed on her, you know, and know that this is commonplace. If that isn't a situation that calls out for salvation, you know, of America's soul, then I don't know what is. And so, you know, I know that this is, it would be a long shot that this convinces the hardcore reactionaries who decided that CRT is evil. But I would just hope that people who are still like on the fence would seriously consider, you know, what is salvation even? And how are we saved in a world where one way that evil manifests is through racism? You know?
Yeah. And I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle right now, and a glaring and intentional misreading of the situation, a glaring misreading of, again, American history, a glaring misreading of critical race theory and what it purports to do, and furthermore, a glaring hypocrisy with folks that are seeing the accusations of personal failings. And we talked right before we started recording about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He has this incredible quote in Life Together where he talks about the fact that if we really believe that God is good and that we are sinful, which is about the most basic Christian tenets, if we really believe that, then when somebody calls out our sin, we won't dissemble, is the word that's translated from the German and English. Then we won't fall apart when we are called out on our failings, on our moral failings. And really brings to mind even the biblical example of King David when he has had a soldier murdered so that he can sleep with the soldier's wife, and they have a child together. In the midst of all that, the prophet Nathan comes to him and has a strong rebuke, and what David does is repents. And so that is, there's nothing really more Christian or moral than repenting when we're having things pointed out. So talk a bit more about Bonhoeffer and all this, because as you mentioned, I love Bonhoeffer.
Well, one of the reasons I got into this work was I was incredibly moved by Charles Marsha's biography of Bonhoeffer, Strange Glory. And, the open letter refers to the Barber Declaration, the 1933 Barber Declaration, very deliberately, because, I do see it as sort of continuing in that spirit. But one of the things about the Barber Declaration, which, spoke to the crisis of the German church, on whether to go along with Nazification or not, behind the scenes, what struck me was that Bonhoeffer was quite frustrated with the fact that it didn't go far enough.
Sure.
That he felt like, as powerful as the Barber Declaration was, it did not call out specifically enough the moral dilemma that the Nazis had imposed on Jewish Christians, as well as, clergy were basically being told to deny Christians of Jewish descent fellowship and membership in the church. And I took that as a real warning that, often, especially now that the boogeyman of cancel culture, which is, almost the evil twin of CRT in the conservative imagination, has such a grip on people that, and this has come up in many declines, people who decided not to sign the letter. It's not just, oh, I'm sympathetic, but if I speak out, I get blowback. It's, this all feels a little harsh, isn't it? Like naming names and getting specific. Isn't it all rather, heated, and, isn't it all rather cancel culture like?
Yeah.
And the lesson that I took from Bonhoeffer is no. It is a basic act of meeting the urgency of the moment with the honesty that it requires. And certainly that was the case in the story of David and Nathan in the Bible. It's funny how so many conservatives cited David as a template for Trump when saying, well, nobody's perfect, but they kind of excise the part where, well, if you're going to call him David, then you should be prepared for the Nathans who come to the door. So that was interesting. But it's, I see Bonhoeffer's one of the messages that I took from Bonhoeffer is, to really honor that spirit. History never repeats itself, obviously, I think it's easy to get bogged down in hair splitting or how much like, 1930s Germany are we at this point. But certainly we can say the fact that we're talking about that is really not a good sign, right? And so the question becomes, since we're talking about that, what's our responsibility? Are we going to be content with just sort of very general denunciations of racism because we're afraid to step on people's toes for highlighting their personal failings? Or are we going to meet the urgency of the moment with the honesty that it requires?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I commend you in speaking that truth. And like so many that I've spoken to that have been involved in this sort of work, I'm just so impressed. I'm so impressed that you come at it with hope that people can change. I have a real hard time with believing that the folks can change.
Oh, I have a hard time too.
Yeah.
I have a hard time too. And I'll even say this, I think it is time to recuperate the language of demonization for the left. There's this book, Reviving Old Scratch. Man, I can't remember the name of the author at this point, but he was sort of going into Walter Wink vein, that there is a power to reclaiming that language of principalities and powers. And, I know that this will sound kind of like, you're kind of saying that these are reprobates and they're beyond redemption. No, I'm not saying that, but I am saying that when the Bible talks about the father of lies, the prince of darkness, the principalities and powers, what it's talking about is power. And I would say, like, the more power you have, the more you lie and abuse in service of that power, the more that comparison to the principalities and powers is warranted and deserves to be part of the conversation. That doesn't mean that you can't be set free from your bondage to the principalities and powers. But the reason that there is this ambiguity in the New Testament, there's been this debate: does the principalities and powers refer to political structures or to spiritual? I think that ambiguity is deliberate, and that's because at a certain level, there's an identity confusion. Yeah, exactly. So I really believe that the cancel culture meme has to die, in order for actual transformation and repentance to go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Lucas Kwong, I really appreciate your time. I'm happy to join in your work, and I'm again so impressed with your willingness to tell the truth, even though you're not backed by George Soros or whatever.
I wish.
Yeah, exactly. If George Soros is listening,
oh man,
we could both use some cash.
Yeah.
We probably both have some issues with some of your past, George, but we'll take your money.
We'll take it.
I'll get over
that. Yeah.
But yeah, there's no money coming from that, and you've put a lot of your time and with no upside to yourself personally, except for being able to tell the truth and being able to hopefully sleep at night. So I hope you can at least sleep at night, and
thank you
in the midst of this. And yeah, just really look forward to keeping connected. And
well, thank you for having me on and for the cameo appearance.
Yes. Yes. So for anyone watching this video later, and I'll edit this out of the podcast part, but for anyone watching this later, my children came into my room as we were talking, and that is a result of me messing up our times and setting up a movie for them an hour before Lucas and I actually got to talk. So
I thought it was I thought it was they were so exercised by what happened at the PCA annual conference that they wanted to weigh in.
I'm sure I'll check with them later. I'm sure that factors in. So yeah. Well, yeah, thanks again, and let's talk soon.
Let's do it soon. Thanks a lot, Casey.
All right, thanks.